before I speak today, I have to do so with a heavy heart because what you're about to hear changed everything. The announcement lasted less than 3 minutes, yet those few moments shattered weeks of carefully guarded silence. Prince Edward sat beside Sophie, barely able to hide his emotions, as she revealed what Buckingham Palace had avoided saying. King Charles had suffered a serious setback during his treatment at Windsor Castle, and his doctors had ordered him to step away from all public duties for an indefinite period. Edward's trembling silence said more than any official statement ever could. This was no ordinary health update, it marked the beginning of one of the monarchy's most uncertain chapters. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the latest royal updates. At Bagshot Park, Sophie looked into the camera and chose every word with extraordinary care. While the palace was preparing an official statement describing the cancelled engagements as nothing more than minor diary changes, she knew that version no longer reflected reality. Charles had become severely exhausted after treatment, his recovery plan had been suspended, and doctors had placed him under constant medical supervision. There was no room left for comforting language. Edward tried to continue reading, but when he reached the words, "Our beloved brother," emotion overwhelmed him. He lowered the page, unable to continue. Sophie quietly placed her hand over his, waiting until he found the strength to go on. She believed protecting Charles's privacy was an act of compassion, but protecting a carefully crafted image while hiding the truth was something entirely different. Edward shared her concern, even though he feared people would see their honesty as betrayal rather than loyalty. The doctors had been absolutely clear. Charles was to avoid all public appearances until his condition stabilized. Yet the palace's planned statement suggested he would return within days, creating expectations that placed even greater pressure on the king to appear strong, while his body desperately needed rest. Then Sophie revealed something that changed the entire story. Charles himself had instructed them to tell the truth if palace language ever began hiding the seriousness of his condition. He had even recorded a private message after suffering the setback, but somehow, that recording never reached the public, and no explanation was ever given. When the recording finally ended, Edward quietly removed his glasses, lowered his head, and whispered that his brother should never have been forced to carry such pain in silence. Sophie remained beside him, knowing they had protected Charles, but at the same time challenged the palace itself. Moments later, William's phone rang. Camilla had already learned about the recording, and had tried to stop it before it became public. But it was too late, the truth was already spreading, and behind every royal title stood 4 people facing fears no one could control. Charles struggled to protect his dignity. William found himself confronting responsibilities he had never expected to face so soon. Edward feared he had hurt the brother he wanted to protect, while Sophie carried the burden of saying what everyone else had been afraid to admit. Their grief united them, but their understanding of loyalty no longer did. For years, Edward had supported his older brother without asking for recognition. He accepted difficult duties, quietly represented the crown, and rarely questioned royal decisions. That was exactly why his public statement carried such weight. He wasn't trying to weaken Charles, he simply could no longer watch him suffer behind carefully chosen words. Sophie faced the same conflict from another perspective. She had often helped calm family disagreements before they became public crises. She respected Charles's desire for privacy, but she also knew he despised deliberate deception. Protecting someone who was ill showed compassion, creating false reassurance while his health decline did not. Alone inside Windsor, Charles watched Edward and Sophie's statement. Hearing his condition described openly made him visibly uncomfortable, yet when Sophie explained why silence could no longer continue, relief slowly appeared across his face. For the first time, he no longer had to pretend that recovery was simple. Outside the room, William stood frozen before the door. Seeing his father in such a fragile condition made the future suddenly feel much closer. The crown no longer seemed like a distant responsibility waiting years ahead, it now stood only a few steps away. Edward quietly told William that Charles had already prepared written instructions, allowing certain royal duties to be transferred before the palace publicly admitted his condition had worsened. Senior members of the family could temporarily carry out selected responsibilities, while Charles remained king. But Sophie's next discovery raised even more troubling questions. During a review of the latest medical briefing, she noticed 2 important paragraphs had disappeared. Those missing sections explained that public appearances were slowing Charles's recovery and placing him under severe physical strain. Someone hadn't simply softened the truth, someone had deliberately erased it. William finally entered the room. Charles tried to rise, but his son gently stopped him. "You don't have to be strong for us anymore." The king looked at William, then at Edward and Sophie, and suddenly understood something heartbreaking. His family had been protecting the man, while the palace had been protecting the image. Only one question remained. Who had decided that calming the nation mattered more than telling it the truth? The answer didn't begin with Edward and Sophie's announcement. It began 11 nights earlier, during a glittering reception inside Windsor Castle. Surrounded by chandeliers, diplomats, and smiling guests, Charles suddenly reached for the back of a chair. His balance failed him. The music continued, conversations never stopped, and almost no one noticed. Only Sophie saw his trembling hand. Those next few minutes became the secret around which every palace statement would later be built, the moment the family would remember as the point where everything changed. Charles had ignored clear medical advice because he believed one successful appearance would reassure the nation. The diplomatic reception had been carefully planned to show a strong and active monarch, but Edward and Sophie already knew what no guest could see. Earlier that afternoon, Charles had quietly admitted that he felt unusually weak. From opposite sides of the room, Edward and Sophie watched him closely, expecting the evening to end early. Instead, Charles continued greeting guests, smiling through obvious exhaustion, refusing every gentle suggestion to leave. For decades, duty had carried him through every challenge. But on that night, duty itself had become the greatest danger. Charles turned toward a visiting ambassador, and in an instant, the color drained from his face. His hand reached for the back of a chair, but before he could steady himself, his balance gave way. Sophie was at his side within seconds, catching his arm before he could fall. At the same moment, Edward stepped between his brother and the crowded room, shielding the king from curious eyes while the music continued and the guests remained unaware of what had just happened. Charles quietly pleaded with them not to cause alarm. His voice was weak, but his request was unmistakable. Edward wanted to honor his brother's wishes, yet every instinct told him that Charles needed immediate medical attention. Without hesitation, he guided the king through a private corridor while Sophie urgently called the royal physician. None of them realized those hidden 7 minutes would soon shape the future of the monarchy. Almost immediately, silence became official policy. Palace staff were instructed to describe the king's departure as nothing more than a routine scheduling adjustment. During a later meeting, Sophie strongly objected when officials suggested announcing another engagement just a few days later. They argued that canceling too many appearances might create public concern about the king's ability to carry out his constitutional role, but Sophie knew the greater danger was pretending everything was normal. The following morning, reality became impossible to ignore. Charles reached for his pen to sign an official document, but his trembling hand could no longer hold it. The pen slipped onto the desk. Edward quietly pushed the papers aside and called the physician himself. No carefully written statement could erase what he had just witnessed. Later, Sophie found Charles sitting alone beside a cup of tea that had long gone cold. He admitted he remembered the room spinning, but couldn't even remember who had helped him to safety. That confession made everything painfully clear. When Edward insisted the royal diary be cleared of every upcoming engagement, Camilla stepped forward with a warning. The public must never see the crown retreat. Edward looked directly at her. This time, he refused to stay silent. The doors closed, the advisors left, and only 4 members of the royal family remained. There were no titles, no ceremonies, only a family facing an impossible truth. Camilla defended the decision to protect public confidence, while Edward stood holding the physician's warning that had been kept from public view. Sophie watched Charles struggle simply to remain standing. Then Edward placed the medical document on the table and spoke with a determination his family had rarely heard before. "He is my brother, before he is your symbol." Camilla had called the meeting after learning that Edward and Sophie's recorded statement was ready to be released. She demanded they delay it until a revised palace announcement could be approved, believing the wording would calm the public. Sophie refused. Another carefully softened statement, she said, would only deepen the deception. Despite strict medical advice to stay in bed, Charles entered the room himself. He believed the discussion concerned his own dignity, and he refused to let others decide what the nation should hear without his voice being part of the conversation. Moments later, William arrived, shocked and angry that his father's condition had been minimized while he remained unaware of how serious things had become. Camilla argued that the monarchy could not afford to appear frightened. Public uncertainty, she warned, could weaken confidence across the country. Sophie answered calmly, but with unmistakable conviction. Illness is not failure. Forcing Charles to appear strong while his health continued to decline had already placed him in danger, and she would no longer help protect an image at the cost of the man himself. Edward laid the physician's written warning before his brother. His voice broke as he admitted that remaining silent after the collapse at Windsor felt like abandoning the person he loved most. Charles lowered his eyes, unable to answer. The report clearly stated he needed complete rest, yet a balcony appearance still remained in the proposed schedule. William stared at the page in disbelief. Standing before the public during such an appearance would demand strength Charles simply did not have. He demanded to know who had left it there. Camilla denied approving the plan, pointing instead toward the communications office, but her answer only raised even more troubling questions. Finally, Charles spoke. He revealed that he had never approved the phrase, minor diary adjustment. He had believed the public was being told he required a lengthy recovery, but somewhere along the way, someone had changed the message before it reached the nation. Camilla quietly reached for the medical report, but William immediately slid it back toward his father. Charles compared the original medical warning with the altered palace statement, then lowered both pages without saying a word. The silence inside the room felt heavier than anything that had been spoken. Then the king looked at Edward and Sophie. "Release it, exactly as it was recorded." The couple exchanged an emotional glance. Camilla slowly turned away, realizing she no longer controlled the announcement. William remained focused on the altered documents. One official alone could never have changed so many details. The family had uncovered the truth about Charles's condition, but the system responsible for hiding it was only beginning to reveal itself. This wasn't the work of a single person, or a single decision. The truth had been buried piece by piece, through edited sentences, delayed conversations, and officials who convinced themselves that protecting stability mattered more than honesty. Determined to find answers, William entered the private secretariat with Edward beside him. Inside the records room, every version of the king's medical guidance had been carefully stored. It didn't take long. Hidden beneath the engagement diary, William found the physician's original report. Its warning could not have been clearer. Charles was to avoid prolonged standing, unnecessary travel, and demanding ceremonial appearances until doctors completed another assessment. Edward watched frustration grow across William's face, but quietly reminded him of one difficult truth. Their father himself had repeatedly insisted on carrying on. Charles believed that discipline could overcome exhaustion, and that determination had encouraged nervous officials to believe one more appearance might still be possible. The palace had made serious mistakes, but Charles had also helped sustain the illusion, because admitting weakness frightened him more than continuing despite the risk. Meanwhile, Sophie confronted another part of the story. She asked the senior communications secretary why the strongest medical warnings had disappeared from the public statements. The official admitted that every cancelled engagement created new speculation about succession, stability, and whether the king could continue serving. Staff had become trapped between medical reality and fear of public reaction. But fear alone did not explain everything. The documents revealed the truth. One edit replaced the words "significant setback" with "temporary fatigue." Another changed "complete withdrawal" into "a lighter program." Those weren't harmless changes. They created false hope, encouraged the public to expect a quick return, and placed enormous pressure on Charles to meet expectations his body simply could not fulfill. Then William uncovered something even more alarming. The final changes had been approved under a standing authority that had quietly remained in place since an earlier health scare, a system that allowed major edits to be made without seeking fresh approval from the king himself. William soon uncovered the truth behind the changes. A standing authority had allowed designated officials to approve sensitive communications without seeking fresh permission each time. No single signature had authorized the altered statements. The system itself had made them possible. As William opened the engagement diary, he froze. 6 public appearances were still penciled into the schedule, even though the medical warnings beside them were marked in red. He slowly closed the diary and looked toward the secretary. "My father is not a schedule to be protected." Edward stood firmly beside him, while Sophie insisted every edited statement be preserved for a full review. Without hesitation, William suspended the standing authority. From that moment forward, every medical announcement would require approval from Charles, his physician, and a trusted member of the family. But the decision came after the damage had already been done. Engagements disappeared from the calendar, officials were quietly removed, and anxious conversations spread throughout the palace. When Camilla received the revised protocol in a sealed envelope, she read it twice before lowering the document in silence. She immediately realized her access to future medical drafts had been restricted. The system that had hidden the truth had finally collapsed, and its consequences arrived all at once. By the following morning, the royal diary was almost empty. Ceremonies were reassigned, receptions postponed, and one chair remained painfully vacant during the daily briefing at Buckingham Palace. For decades, Charles had always been the first to arrive. Now, his folder remained unopened while William silently looked through his father's handwritten notes. Across Windsor, Camilla received the updated schedule without saying a word. Edward and Sophie had chosen honesty, but honesty had forced the entire family to confront a reality none of them had been prepared to face. The palace confirmed that every public engagement involving Charles had been cancelled. William, Anne, Edward, and Sophie would divide the essential duties between them, allowing the monarchy to continue functioning while the king recovered, and would oversee military ceremonies, while Edward and Sophie carried forward the charitable work that meant the most to Charles. Despite the changes, no regency had been declared. Charles remained king, fully informed, and still capable of approving state business. Only selected public responsibilities would temporarily be carried out by other senior members of the family. That difference mattered. His authority remained untouched, but the empty chair reminded everyone how suddenly his absence had become real. The moment became deeply personal for William when an aide mistakenly placed the famous red dispatch box in front of him. For a brief second, he simply stared at it. That box belonged beside his father, not beside him. Quietly, William pushed it away, rested his hand on the back of Charles's chair, and chose not to sit there. Instead, he moved closer, leaving his father's place exactly as it was. Meanwhile, Sophie returned to Windsor expecting criticism. She feared Charles would see her honesty as an act of betrayal. Instead, he surprised her. He admitted that he felt ashamed his family had been forced to defend his health when he could no longer defend it himself. Sophie answered gently, "Needing protection does not make you weak." As the days passed, the consequences continued to grow. 2 senior communications officials were removed from royal health briefings while an internal investigation began. Their removal made one thing clear: the altered statements were no longer being dismissed as simple wording mistakes. Someone had abused their authority, and the palace intended to discover exactly how far that concealment had reached. Camilla faced another painful reality when the revised communication protocol arrived. From now on, medical drafts would reach William and Edward before they reached her. She folded the document slowly, understanding that the change was far more than administrative. It reflected a loss of trust. Edward cancelled his own commitments to remain beside his brother, while Sophie quietly took over 2 of Charles's charitable meetings, carrying the notes he had prepared before his setback. Duty continued, but every responsibility now carried the weight of his absence. That evening, after the advisors, officials, and staff had all departed, Charles asked Sophie to remain behind. Inside a quiet sitting room at Windsor, there were no cameras, no speeches, and no palace protocol. Only 2 untouched cups of tea, and an honest conversation. For the first time since his illness, Charles stopped asking how the monarchy would survive. Instead, he asked something far more personal. "Will my family forgive me?" Sophie answered with kindness, but without hesitation. They could forgive his fear, but they could no longer help him pretend that courage meant suffering in silence. Charles lowered his eyes and finally admitted why he had accepted the vague public statements. He feared that if the truth became public, every cause, every charity, and every duty he had worked for would be overshadowed by endless discussion about his health. He wanted people to remember the work, not the illness. But in trying to protect his legacy, he had trapped himself inside an impossible image of strength. Sophie quietly reminded him that allowing others to share responsibilities did not mean surrendering the crown. It simply meant protecting the man who carried it. Accepting help, she told him, was not the same as giving up. Charles then revealed the fear he had never spoken aloud. He believed William would see this setback as proof that their time together was running out. He could face doctors. He could face public opinion. But he didn't know how to face the look in his son's eyes. Every softened statement had delayed that painful moment, while pushing William further away. Sophie gently told him another truth. Edward's anger had never come from ambition. It came from love. After recording the announcement, Edward had remained sitting in silence, removed his glasses, lowered his head, and quietly whispered that his brother should never have faced such suffering alone. Then, at exactly 8 o'clock, television broadcasts across the country were interrupted. Charles appeared before the nation without royal fanfare, without ceremonial music, and without promises he could not honestly make. His voice was quieter than people remembered, but every word carried the weight of everything that had remained unspoken. He thanked Edward and Sophie for having the courage to tell the truth when fear had made honesty so difficult. Then he admitted what the palace had avoided saying. His recovery would take longer than he had hoped. Across Britain, anxiety slowly gave way to compassion. Charles openly acknowledged that his treatment had taken a far greater physical toll than expected. He announced that he would temporarily step back from public appearances, follow his doctor's advice, and continue essential state duties privately whenever his strength allowed. He was not abandoning his responsibilities. He was finally accepting that true service did not require sacrificing his health. Charles made one final promise. He would never again push himself beyond his limits simply to preserve an image. Then, one by one, he mentioned the people who had stood beside him. William, Camilla, Anne, Edward, and Sophie. Those few words changed everything. Instead of allowing the crisis to divide the family in public, Charles brought them back together. Camilla lowered her eyes as he acknowledged the pain that had spread through the household, and remained silent, gripping the arm of her chair, fully aware that his words carried both gratitude and a warning. At Bagshot Park, Edward listened beside Sophie. Then Charles called him, "My steadfast brother." Edward covered his mouth, struggling to hold back tears. Sophie quietly reached for his hand, just as she had during their original recording. Edward had feared that telling the truth would destroy his relationship with his brother. Instead, Charles had used his own voice to heal it. Back at Windsor, William remained silent until the broadcast ended. Then he turned toward his father and simply said, "The truth has made you stronger, not weaker." For a moment, the weight Charles had been carrying seemed to lift. The response he had feared most had become the reassurance he needed. During the address, Charles also accepted responsibility for the earlier statements. He admitted the palace had failed to communicate the true seriousness of his condition, and he refused to place all the blame on dismissed officials. His own fear, he confessed, had allowed softened language to continue. Then he announced a permanent change. From that day forward, every health update would place medical accuracy ahead of image management. Private details could still remain private, but the palace would never again create a false impression of the king's ability to serve. The following morning, the country's reaction surprised everyone. Newspapers carried the image of a tired but honest king, while people gathered outside Buckingham Palace, not with flowers, but with handwritten messages of support. Across Britain, one simple sentence began appearing again and again. Duty is not refusing help, duty is knowing when to accept it. Compassion replaced uncertainty, but the real test would come after the cameras disappeared. Later, Charles opened a nearby drawer and removed a recording he had made just 2 days after collapsing at Windsor. In that private message, he openly acknowledged his setback and asked the public to accept his temporary absence without losing confidence in the monarchy. There were no polished speeches, no carefully chosen reassurances, only the voice of a man who sounded tired, uncertain, and completely human. Charles admitted he had hidden the recording because he had not found the courage to release it. Then he placed it into Sophie's hands. "Your honesty gave me the strength to finish what I couldn't." Sophie quietly moved beside him. When Charles asked if he had failed, she answered softly, "No, but you almost disappeared behind the crown." Charles then asked Edward to join them. As his brother entered the room, Charles reached for his hand and thanked him for choosing family over palace strategy. For the first time since everything began, Edward's anger gave way to relief. Sophie watched in silence as the distance between the two brothers finally disappeared. The hidden recording was prepared for public release. What had begun as a private confession would soon become a message heard across homes, streets, and television screens throughout the country. In the end, the monarchy survived, not because Charles hid his weakness, but because those closest to him refused to let him carry it alone. Edward and Sophie's decision had seemed controversial at first, yet it reminded everyone of an important truth. There is a difference between protecting someone's dignity and denying their reality. In the quiet weeks that followed, royal duties continued, constitutional work remained stable, and for the first time, Charles was allowed to recover without pretending to be stronger than he truly felt. 3 weeks later, doctors confirmed that the extended rest was producing the improvement constant public engagements had prevented. The crown continued to function, but now, Now, the man wearing it finally had the chance to heal. William carried out essential constitutional responsibilities, while Edward, Sophie, and maintained the king's public commitments. Anne's calm leadership proved that sharing responsibility did not weaken the monarchy, it strengthened it. Soon afterward, Charles invited Edward and Sophie to a private family lunch, with no advisors, no officials, and no prepared speeches. As they entered, Charles slowly stood, embraced his brother, and admitted that speaking honestly had saved him from his own stubbornness. Edward smiled with visible relief. Sophie quietly reminded him that protecting his life had always mattered more than protecting a perfect image. Camilla also faced her own moment of accountability. During a private conversation, she admitted that preserving stability had gradually become an excuse for controlling the truth. She apologized directly to Sophie. Trust was not restored overnight, but Sophie accepted the apology as the first step toward healing. Meanwhile, those responsible for weakening the medical statements were permanently removed from future health communications. Charles signed a new directive placing medical judgment above ceremonial scheduling. Under the new system, future palace statements could protect privacy, but they could never misrepresent the king's condition. Not long afterward, Charles took his first walk through the Windsor Gardens with his family. Halfway through, fatigue forced him to stop. This time, he didn't pretend otherwise. Edward immediately offered his arm, and without hesitation, Charles accepted it. There was no embarrassment, no attempt to hide his weakness, only quiet acceptance. For the first time, support no longer felt like surrender. William watched his father walking at a slower, healthier pace, and realized leadership inside the family had changed forever. Edward and Sophie had never weakened the king by telling the truth. They had protected the man behind the crown, reminding everyone that real loyalty sometimes means saying what others are too afraid to say. Charles remained king. William remained his devoted heir, and the family emerged stronger because they chose honesty over appearances. The crown did not become weaker when its wearer admitted vulnerability. It became more human, more believable, and perhaps stronger than ever before. In the end, silence protected an image, but the truth protected Charles, and that became the greatest duty of all. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.